July 8, 1944. The rain fell in heavy sheets over Saipan, drumming against the canvas roofs of U.S. field tents. Smoke still rose from shattered ridges where just days earlier Japanese soldiers had made their final desperate charges. Among the captured was a young Navy nurse, her white armband smeared with mud and ash. She had been told since training that capture was worse than death, that Americans would defile her, strip her dignity, and cast her aside as less than human. Her heart hammered as guards guided her into the POW compound. Every footstep on gravel seemed to echo a funeral march. The air was thick with carbolic soap iodine and the strange aroma of roasted meat drifting from somewhere beyond the wire. She braced for cruelty, her eyes fixed on the bayonets glinting in the humid night. Then, without ceremony, a medic pointed toward an iron cot inside a long, orderly tent. A thin mattress stretched across it, covered by a white sheet, a folded wool blanket laid neatly at the foot. She lowered herself cautiously, expecting hardness, discomfort, punishment. Instead, the bed gave way with a soft creak of springs cradling her body in a way tatami mats at home never had. She froze fingers, curling against fabric that was impossibly clean. In that moment, confusion drowned fear. Could the enemy's mercy truly feel softer than home itself? The journey into captivity began with the sound of boots in mud and the rattle of truck engines. After the fighting on Saipan had collapsed into chaos, the survivors were herded toward American positions under the harsh glare of floodlights. The young nurse clutched the remnants of her satchel, stripped of scalpels and medicine, carrying only bandages now soaked through with rain. She had expected this moment to be her last, some brutal end at the hands of men she had been warned would show no restraint. Instead, the guards motioned her forward with curt gestures, rifles slung but fingers off the triggers. The truck ride was silent, save for the cough of the motor and the whisper of rain striking the tarpaulin cover. Around her other women sat rigid eyes cast down, knuckles white, where they clenched their knees. They exchanged no words. Fear pressed too heavily on their throats. From the corners of the canvas, drops of water dripped steadily, marking time in a rhythm that felt like a countdown to something unspeakable. She thought of the leaflets burned into her memory, the slogans that had promised death over dishonor, and she braced herself for degradation. Yet the truck did not stop at a ditch or a firing line. It jolted to a halt beside a low building lit by kerosene lamps. Inside, Americans waited not with whips but with clipboards. A line formed moving toward a station where each prisoner was checked, catalogued, and dusted with acrid white powder against lice. The nurse flinched when a medic reached for her wrist, but instead of striking, he examined her pulse, his eyes searching for fever. He did not speak in cruelty, only called for another to note her name on a tag written in careful block letters. She was not an enemy to be broken, she was a body to be managed. The shock deepened with every step. Her shoes scuffed across gravel into a yard bordered by barbed wire. She expected snarls and shoves, but instead the guards merely gestured, guiding with restraint. Their faces were unreadable, not celebratory, not sadistic, only disciplined. To the nurse this was disorienting. Had she not been told the Americans reveled in their captives' pain? Where were the jeers, the laughter? Passing under the compound gate, the smell reached her first. It was thick and unmistakable coffee, mingling with the greasy comfort of bacon fat drifting from a mess tent. Her stomach lurched in betrayal. She had not smelled such abundance in years. Hunger, tightly controlled by discipline, threatened to betray her composure. The nurse forced her gaze to the ground, refusing to acknowledge the scent that mocked her endurance. Inside the barracks, order reigned. Rows of iron cots stretched in disciplined formation, each with mosquito netting tucked tight. A young American medic demonstrated how to fold the wool blanket into a precise rectangle, sliding it across the sheet until it aligned. She could barely comprehend what she saw, every bed clean, every pillow set square, every floorboard swept. It was not the den of cruelty imagined by propaganda. It was a place that smelled of soap and starch. Her turn came. She stepped toward the cot assigned to her, fingers trembling. It was impossible to imagine rest after days of bombardment, weeks of retreat. She lowered herself cautiously, anticipating the straw mats of home, the hardness of earth beneath thin futons. Instead, the mattress yielded with a sigh of springs, soft yet firm. cradling her weight with a gentleness that made her body shudder. For the first time since capture, tears burned in her eyes. She pressed her palms against the sheet as if testing reality. How could the enemy's bed feel softer than anything she had ever known in her own home? The sensation was unbearable because it was kind. She wanted to recoil, to remind herself this was illusion, yet her body betrayed. Her muscles, unclenched, shoulders, sagged exhaustion, overtook fear. Around her other women whispered in disbelief. One muttered about the pillow's scent of detergent, another about the strange luxury of mosquito netting. A third touched the metal frame as if expecting it to vanish. They should have been humiliated, yet all were subdued by the same confusion. Why would the enemy offer comfort? The nurse tried to resist. She told herself it was interrogation theatre, a calculated trick to soften will. She whispered a vow into the blanket that she would not trust softness. But when the barracks lights dimmed and silence descended, she felt her body sink deeper into the mattress, unwillingly soothed. Her heart throbbed with shame, yet also with a relief so intense it frightened her. That night, rain tapped the roof like a metronome. In the distance, somewhere near the wire, a phonograph played a faint American melody, brass notes drifting through the humid air. She lay still, staring at the canvas ceiling, her mind caught between two worlds, the one she had been trained to believe in, where Americans were monsters, and the one she now touched with her hands. A clean bed, a folded blanket, the smell of soap. Dawn broke not with screams but with a bugle. She sat up slowly, realizing she had slept without nightmares for the first time in months. The bed had done its work, though she resented it. Rising, she folded the blanket as instructed hands, moving with mechanical precision, heart still trembling with questions she dared not ask. The arrival shock was not the barbed wire, nor the guards, nor the inspection. It was the bed the enemy's mercy delivered in springs and cotton. And from that night onward, every creak of the mattress would remind her that war was not unfolding as she had been told. The true battle was no longer outside the fence. It was within, where fear and doubt wrestled with the dangerous temptation of comfort. Morning inside the American camp began not with chaos but with an unfamiliar order. At first light, a bugle note stretched across the compound, thin and metallic. The young Japanese nurse startled awake, disoriented by the stillness of her body after a full night's rest. She had not dreamed of bombs or gunfire. Instead, she had dreamed of nothing at all, the deep sleep of a child. Rising from the cot, she felt the springs release her weight reluctantly, as if they wished to hold her a little longer. The softness clung to her, even after she placed her bare feet on the polished floorboards. The roll call followed. Guards with clipboards and translators counted heads, their voices clipped but never cruel. Prisoners shuffled into line, some bowing instinctively out of habit, others staring defiantly. The nurse stood rigid, waiting for the slap that never came, the barked insult that propaganda had promised. Instead, the guards checked names, nodded, and moved on. The absence of humiliation unsettled her more than abuse would have. Cruelty she could understand. Discipline cloaked in restraint was far more dangerous. It forced her to question every certainty she had carried into captivity. Breakfast was served in a mess hall built from corrugated tin. The smells struck first: bread, baking potatoes, boiling coffee hissing in giant metal urns. Stainless ladles clanged against trays as each prisoner received a measured portion. The nurse accepted her plate mechanically. A scoop of oatmeal, a slice of pale bread, and a small pat of butter melting under the heat. She stared at it as though it might detonate. Butter, an impossible luxury in her homeland where even rice had become scarce. Around her, the other women hesitated, too torn between hunger and suspicion. Yet the guards simply stepped aside, indifferent to whether the food was eaten or not. The nurse lifted the spoon with trembling fingers. The oatmeal was bland but warm, coating her tongue with a softness she had almost forgotten. Her stomach cramped in protest, unaccustomed to such weight, but it also whispered gratitude. She wanted to spit it out to resist this silent temptation, but each swallow slid down like a betrayal she could not stop committing. Daily routines began to take shape. At set hours, prisoners were marched to the latrines where cold water taps ran freely. Soap was rationed, harsh and smelling of carbolic, but it lathered in her hands and rinsed away the grime of weeks spent in the caves. She remembered scrubbing wounds with bare fingers, the stench of infection, the suffocating smoke of battle. Here the act of washing felt like sacrilege. Cleanliness belonged to peace, not to her. Inspections followed. American officers walked through the barracks, boots thudding against wood eyes, scanning for disorder. They spoke through interpreters, reminding the women to keep cots tight, blankets folded to corners, belongings stored neatly. It was military order, not kindness, but it was not cruelty either. The young nurse obeyed without question, though her hands trembled as she tucked sheets with a precision she had never practiced even at home. Each corner folded was an admission that she was conforming to their rhythm. The guards themselves remained an enigma. Some were young men barely older than she, their faces smooth and sunburnt. Others were hardened veterans, silent behind their cigarettes. None behaved like the monsters she had been promised. They barked orders, yes, but with the tone of routine rather than malice. One even dropped his rifle once and laughed awkwardly, a sound so human it startled her more than a threat would have. She realized with unease that she was studying them as people, not demons. In the afternoons, work details were organized. Some prisoners cleaned the compound. Others tended small gardens under supervision. The nurse was excused from heavy labor due to her lingering wounds, but she often found herself near the infirmary. There American medics treated scratches, sprains, and coughs with brisk efficiency. She recognized the technique's sterilizing instruments, measuring doses, and felt her fingers twitch with the instinct to assist. Once without thinking, she corrected the way a bandage was tied. The medic looked at her with surprise, then nodded his thanks. That nod shook her to her core. Recognition, not contempt. But the strangest contrast lay beyond the wire. Rumors filtered in villages, burned cities, starved families in Japan, surviving on scraps of barley and weeds. Inside the camp, meals arrived on schedule, beds remained clean, soap was distributed. The nurse began to feel as though she lived in an impossible dream. Every comfort within the fence mocked the devastation outside it. Each night, as she lay on the mattress, she whispered apologies into the darkness for being fed, while her countrymen starved for resting while others still fought. She started keeping a secret journal, scribbling on scraps of packaging and smuggled paper. Her words were cautious, half-coded. "The bed is too soft," she wrote one night. "It betrays me. It cradles me when I should be sharp as a blade. It lulls me into believing mercy can be real." Writing helped her hold the line between suspicion and surrender, but every morning when she woke, refreshed, the line grew thinner. Evenings were the hardest. When the compound lights dimmed and the guards' boots faded, silence wrapped the barracks. She could hear the breathing of the other women, the occasional stifled sob, the rustle of blankets. Sometimes faint music drifted from the American side, swing rhythms, brass horns, alien and seductive. She covered her ears with the pillow as though shutting out the notes could preserve her loyalty. But the melodies seeped in anyway, mingling with the softness of the bed, weaving themselves into her dreams. The paradox consumed her. Inside the fence lay order, sustenance, rest. Outside in the land she had sworn to serve, there was fire, hunger, and ruin. The enemy, it seemed, preserved her body more carefully than her own nation had been able to. This realization gnawed at her sharper than hunger ever had. One evening, as she folded her blanket into perfect corners, she caught her reflection in the polished surface of a metal cup. She barely recognized herself. Cheeks fuller from food, eyes less sunken posture, straighter from rest. Captivity had not stripped her humanity. It was restoring it. That thought terrified her more than the prospect of punishment. What if captivity was not the end of honor, but the beginning of a new truth? Still, she clung to her doubts. Every act of mercy could be a weapon. Every kindness could be a trap. Yet each night when she sank into the bed's forgiving springs, her body betrayed her mind. Sleep came swiftly unresisted, as though the mattress itself insisted she surrender to it. And in that surrender she began to understand that the war was not only fought with rifles and shells. It was fought in the silence of the barracks where mercy waged its quiet, devastating campaign against belief. The morning that changed everything began like all the others. The metallic cry of the bugle, the shuffle of boots on gravel, the call of names through an interpreter. The nurse had risen from her cot with the reluctant stretch of muscles that no longer ached as they once had. Weeks of regular meals and sleep had transformed her body, though her mind still thrashed against the implications. She reminded herself daily this was captivity, not mercy, and yet each day the evidence contradicted her. That morning the mess hall was different. As the women filed in, a scent unlike any she had ever encountered filled the air. It was thick, salty, and intoxicating. Bacon. She had heard of it only in whispers, imagined it as some mythical indulgence. The crackle of fat on iron griddles echoed through the hall. Steam rose in curls, carrying with it the promise of satisfaction, so rich it felt treasonous to desire it. Her stomach, trained to silence during years of scarcity, growled audibly. On the tray that slid into her hands sat 2 fried eggs with their golden centers intact, strips of bacon glistening with grease, a slice of white bread toasted to perfection, and beside it, something she did not recognize, a smear of pale, brown paste inside a small tin. A soldier muttered a word. She barely understood peanut butter, and there was coffee steaming and black poured into a tin mug. She stood frozen, staring at the tray as though it were a battlefield mine. Around her the other women whispered. Some crossed themselves, others hesitated, but soon spoons and forks clinked as hunger overcame suspicion. The nurse sat slowly, lowering herself onto the bench, as if her body were weighted with lead. The bacon sizzled still in her ears. Its smell carried her backward across years. She remembered her childhood kitchen in a small port town, the smell of barley porridge simmering on winter mornings, the hiss of green tea poured into chipped cups. Her mother's hands, thin but graceful, laying out pickled vegetables with quiet care. Her younger brother's laughter as he snatched morsels before the meal was ready. All of it before the war devoured such moments. She lifted the slice of toast and spread a cautious finger of the peanut butter across its surface. It clung thickly, reluctant to let go of the knife shining with a sheen of oil. She raised it to her lips, her heart pounding. When her teeth sank in sweetness and salt mingled in a way she had never known. It was heavy, dense, a foreign comfort. Tears welled before she could stop them. The bacon followed. One bite and salt and fat erupted across her tongue. Her eyes closed, and in the darkness she was no longer in a prison camp, but back at a festival, lanterns, glowing drums, echoing her family whole and laughing. The taste carried her away from barbed wire and boots, away from shame and fear, into a memory that no longer existed in reality. But memory is treacherous. As the flavor lingered, so too did the questions. Was this kindness real, or was it manipulation? Had the enemy discovered that mercy wounded deeper than cruelty? To starve a prisoner was expected, but to feed her until her body healed, this was warfare of another kind. She felt trapped not by the wire but by the generosity that turned her resistance to ash. Her hands shook. To eat was to betray her homeland, to accept comfort from those she had been told were devils. Yet to refuse was to punish herself, to spit upon her own survival. She glanced around. Some women ate quickly, eyes closed, surrendering without shame to the hunger. Others hesitated, nibbling in guilt. One sat rigid, refusing to touch the tray at all, her face twisted in prideful agony. The nurse chose a middle path. She lifted the coffee. Its bitterness seared her tongue, its heat spread down her throat, awakening parts of her that had long been numb. She swallowed, and in that swallow something inside her shifted. It was not surrender, not yet, but it was recognition that survival might mean accepting what she had been told to despise. The rest of the meal blurred. Each bite brought not just flavor, but a flood of memories. Each sip of coffee carried both comfort and shame. She remembered her father's stern lectures about loyalty, her schoolteacher's fiery speeches about honor. Yet in that moment their words felt thin compared to the solidity of the bread, the richness of the bacon. When the tray was empty, she stared at it in silence. Her body was warm, her hunger subdued, yet her mind churned. What kind of enemy fought with butter and blankets instead of chains? What kind of war was this, where mercy struck deeper than any bayonet? That night, lying in her cot, she could not stop thinking about the breakfast. She licked her finger where a smear of peanut butter had clung, ashamed of the desire that flared at the taste. She pressed her face into the pillow, tears soaking the fabric. She was being unmade, not by force but by generosity. She began to write again in her secret journal. Today they gave us food that tasted like childhood, she scribbled. It wounded me more than any bullet. If kindness is a weapon, it has pierced me clean through. The other women whispered too. They spoke of bacon as if it were a dream. One confessed she would never forget the smell, even if she starved tomorrow. Another admitted she thought of her mother as she chewed. The nurse said nothing, but inside she knew they shared the same torment, that food had become more dangerous than hunger. Weeks later, the meals continued. Peanut butter, chocolate, even apple pie appeared in rotation. Each dish carried its own set of memories, its own battles. She came to understand that the Americans fought not only with bombs and bullets, but with the relentless insistence that prisoners were still human. The true war was not outside the fence. It was inside each woman's heart, where kindness gnawed at ideology like termites through wood. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, she admitted silently to herself she no longer knew who she was fighting. The bed cradled her, the food nourished her, the guards ignored her with professionalism rather than hatred. The Japan she had been told to die for felt distant, fading. What remained was the warmth of bacon fat, the sweetness of peanut butter, the comfort of coffee in her hands. And that terrified her more than death ever had. The first cracks in her belief did not come from speeches or interrogations, but from the ordinary rhythm of life inside the camp. Day by day, the American world pressed against her senses, quietly eroding everything she had been taught to fear. It began with the bulletin board near the mess hall. Notices in English, clumsy but decipherable, with the help of an interpreter announced camp schedules, work details, even movie nights. Movie nights. The very concept seemed absurd. War was raging across oceans, and here the enemy invited their captives to sit beneath a canvas awning and watch projected reels of American life. She resisted at first, turning her head when others gathered, but curiosity gnawed at her. Eventually she joined, sitting stiffly in the back row as grainy images flickered against the screen. The reels were simple training films, newsreels, even cartoons, yet they carried a message more dangerous than propaganda. It was a glimpse into a society unbroken, a nation thriving. She saw American women working in factories, smiling in overalls. She saw farmers driving tractors across fields of endless abundance. She saw children in clean schools raising their hands eagerly. None of it matched the image of a decayed, desperate nation that Japanese instructors had hammered into her. Every frame whispered treason into her heart. If this is real, then what else have I been lied to about language lessons came next. At first she resisted, fearing that to speak English was to betray her tongue, her heritage. But the camp interpreter, a Hawaiian Nisei soldier with soft eyes, was patient. He wrote simple words in chalk on a board water blanket book. He repeated them slowly, inviting the prisoners to mimic. She surprised herself by answering. The syllables felt awkward in her mouth, heavy with guilt, yet also exhilarating. With every new word learned, a wall inside her weakened. English was no longer the voice of the enemy. It became a bridge to understanding. Her secret journal reflected this transformation. At first, it was filled with suspicion. The bed is too soft. The food is a trap. But over time, the tone shifted. She began to jot English words beside Japanese ones, to record fragments of conversations, to note the faces of guards who treated her not with cruelty, but with casual indifference. In those pages, the war shrank from an epic struggle of nations to a series of human encounters, moments too small to fit into the rigid frameworks of ideology. The library was the most subversive weapon of all. One afternoon, a guard guided a group of prisoners into a tent lined with shelves. Paperbacks, newspapers, even old magazines were stacked in rows. The smell of ink and paper nearly overwhelmed her. It was the smell of possibility. She ran her fingers across spines she could not yet read, but slowly, with help, she began to understand. She discovered novels that spoke of love, of loss, of journeys across lands she had never imagined. She found medical texts that mirrored her own training, validating her identity not as an enemy but as a nurse, a healer. Each page she turned was another fracture in the edifice of propaganda. The decisive moment came during a routine in the infirmary. An American medic was dressing the wound of another prisoner, fumbling with the bandage. Instinct took over. She stepped forward gently, guiding his hands to fold the gauze properly, tying the knot with practiced precision. For a heartbeat, silence hung between them. Then he smiled faintly and said, "Thank you." 2 simple words. But to her they landed like an artillery shell. Gratitude, not contempt. Respect, not mockery. She felt the ground of her convictions crumble beneath her. If the enemy could thank her, could see her as a professional, then what did it mean to call him monster? At night she wrestled with guilt. Her father's stern voice echoed in memory, "Die before capture." Loyalty above all. Her teachers had sworn that surrender was shame eternal. Yet here she was, alive, fed, thanked, her shame coiled around her like barbed wire. But shame could not erase the reality of warmth spreading through her body or the quiet thrill of recognition. Conversations with other women revealed that she was not alone. They too confessed confusion, speaking in whispers under mosquito netting. One admitted that she dreamed of coffee, another of apple pie. A third clutched a scrap of English phrases like a talisman. Together they wrestled with a shared secret that captivity was not destroying them, but rebuilding them in ways they did not understand. The guards seemed oblivious to this internal war. They went about their duties with professional detachment, smoking cigarettes, playing cards occasionally, tossing a ball between shifts. The very normalcy of their behavior made the women's struggles sharper. How could ordinary men wield such devastating weapons as kindness and restraint? The nurse began to understand the true cruelty of mercy. It demanded reflection. It forced comparison. If Americans treated prisoners with beds and books, what did it say about a homeland where civilians starved and dissenters were silenced? If mercy was possible here behind barbed wire, then why had it not been possible at home? Her journal. Entries grew darker. If this was a lie, she wrote one night, what else had been a lie? Did we starve for honor while food rotted elsewhere? Did we bleed for pride while others lived with dignity? Each word was a rebellion, each question a blow against the walls of indoctrination. And yet, even as her belief system collapsed, she felt trapped in a new cage. The guilt of survival. She envied the certainty of those who refused the food, who sat stiffly and clung to slogans even as their bodies withered. They carried their loyalty visibly. She carried hers as a wound, invisible but bleeding. The climax of this struggle arrived one evening as the projector flickered again. This time the film showed the liberation of villages in Europe. Crowds cheered, children waved, women wept with relief. The Americans on screen were welcomed not as conquerors but as deliverers. She sat frozen, her mind a storm. Could it be true? Could the same nation that held her behind wire also free others beyond it? And if that was true, then what role had her own nation played? When the reel ended, she remained seated long after the others left. The empty screen glowed faintly, and she realized she was staring not at light but at the ruins of her old self. She was no longer certain who she was or what she believed. The slogans of her youth were ashes. The certainties of propaganda were dust. All that remained was the taste of peanut butter, the sound of thank you, and the haunting question. If mercy was possible here, what else had always been possible? In that silence, the war inside her reached its breaking point. Ideology had collapsed, and in its place stood something terrifyingly fragile: doubt. And in that doubt lay the seeds of a new identity she did not yet dare to name. The war ended not with a single sound but with silence. One morning in late summer of 1945 whispers spread across the camp. Japan had surrendered. The words came through interpreters and bulletins, but they landed in the prisoners' hearts like stones. For the nurse, the meaning was almost too large to comprehend. Everything she had endured, the battles, the capture, the soft beds, the bacon and peanut butter, now belonged to a war that was finished. What remained was the question, what would become of her? Weeks later, she found herself aboard a transport ship, bound for a homeland she had not seen in over a year. The sea was grey, the wind sharp. On deck, she clutched the railing, the American-issued coat too large for her thin frame. Around her, other female prisoners huddled together, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the horizon. None spoke of the camp they were leaving behind. To do so felt dangerous, as though the very memory of mercy were contraband. When the ship reached port, the sight broke her heart. The city that rose before them was not the home of her childhood, but a skeleton. Warehouses gutted by fire, neighborhoods reduced to rubble, telephone poles leaning like broken bones. Smoke lingered even months after the bombings. She stepped onto the pier and inhaled the acrid air. Gone was the clean scent of carbolic soap, the order of American barracks. Here the air reeked of ruin. Her family home was unrecognizable. The clinic where she had once trained stood roofless walls collapsed into the street. Her parents were gone, her mother lost to illness, her father vanished during an air raid. Only a distant cousin remained gaunt and hollow-eyed. Together they scavenged, piecing together scraps of existence. Meals consisted of millet, gruel, wild roots, whatever could be bartered on the black market. Hunger returned like an old enemy coiling in her belly, gnawing at her patience. Yet worse than hunger was suspicion. Word travelled quickly. She had been a prisoner. Neighbours muttered as she passed. Some turned away, others whispered. Why didn't she die? Why didn't she choose honour? To have survived captivity was not seen as resilience but as disgrace. Men who had never set foot on a battlefield judged her silently. Women who had lost sons narrowed their eyes with bitterness. She felt the weight of accusation even when no words were spoken. At night she lay on the tatami mats of a makeshift shelter. Hard, thin, unyielding. The memory of the American cot returned with cruel clarity, the way the springs had sighed beneath her weight, the way the wool blanket had warmed her bones. She hated herself for missing it. She buried her face in her arms, cursing the tears that came unbidden. The bed had been mercy, but now it was guilt. She carried other memories too, the taste of peanut butter on toast, the aroma of coffee rising from tin mugs, the nod of gratitude from an American medic. These recollections haunted her more than nightmares of battle. They were not horrors but comforts, and that made them unbearable. She could not speak of them, not to her cousin, not to neighbours. To admit that the enemy had shown kindness would invite contempt, even violence. So she locked the memories away, a secret war inside her chest. By day, she threw herself into rebuilding. She helped establish a small clinic treating malnourished children, binding wounds left untended. Supplies were scarce, but she remembered lessons from the camp, sanitation drills, cot spacing, hand-washing routines. She organized queues with strict order, echoing the barracks inspections. At first, villagers resisted her methods, but soon they saw results. Infections decreased. Children recovered. Without ever admitting it, she was applying American practices smuggled across the sea in memory. Each time she issued soap to a child, she remembered the bitter scent of the camp's carbolic ration. Each time she spaced beds in the shelter, she remembered the perfect lines of iron cots. Each time she instructed a mother to wash her hands before feeding, she heard the calm voice of the medic who had once thanked her. Her survival was inseparable from these recollections, yet she felt shame each time they surfaced. The stigma never faded. In markets, she heard whispers. She ate while we starved. She slept while we burned. She wanted to scream that she had not chosen captivity, that she had lived each day torn between loyalty and survival. But she bit her tongue. To defend herself would be to confess the comforts she had known, and those were luxuries the starving could not forgive. Years passed. The rubble cleared, but scars remained. Japan struggled toward renewal, yet she lived in two worlds, one of deprivation, one of memory. At night she sometimes dreamed of the camp, not of barbed wire or guards, but of breakfast trays of laughter from distant phonographs of the creak of a soft mattress. She woke ashamed, clutching the hard tatami beneath her. The greatest cruelty of mercy was that it endured. Hunger-faded wounds healed, but the kindness she had received could not be erased. It became a private relic, both comfort and curse. She longed to speak of it honestly, to say aloud that the enemy had given her life when her own country could not, but silence was safer. And so she lived with her secret. Each patient saved was a tribute to the methods she had learned in captivity. Each night's sleep on the unforgiving floor was shadowed by the memory of a bed that had cradled her too well. The war was over, but the conflict inside her never ended. She was a survivor caught between shame and gratitude, between a homeland that distrusted her and a memory she dared not honor. For the rest of her life, the soft bed in the American camp remained with her, a memory she could neither reject nor fully embrace. It was the symbol of a paradox she could never resolve, that in her nation's defeat she had found her own survival wrapped in sheets that felt softer than anything she had ever known at home. History remembers wars in terms of numbers, battles fought, cities destroyed, lives lost. Yet for those who lived through it, sometimes the most enduring memories were not the explosions but the silences that followed. For one Japanese nurse, what haunted her long after the gunfire ended was not the sound of artillery but the creak of springs beneath her body, the softness of a bed offered by her enemy. That bed became more than furniture. It was a metaphor for mercy, mercy that had no place in the world she had been taught to believe in. Propaganda told her the Americans were demons, but demons did not hand out blankets, did not serve meals with butter and coffee, did not thank a prisoner for tying a bandage. Every act of kindness contradicted the story she had been told, until ideology cracked under the weight of lived experience. The irony was cruel and unforgettable. She had braced herself for blows, for humiliation, for the lash. Instead, she found comfort. She expected the enemy's hands to strip away her humanity. Instead, they preserved it, and in that preservation she discovered both salvation and torment. For kindness does not leave clean scars, it lingers, demanding questions that cannot be answered. If mercy could exist even here in the heart of war, she later wondered what else had always been possible. What if we had been told the truth all along? The war ended, but the memory of the bed remained soft, silent, inescapable. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the sword or the bomb, but the unyielding insistence on treating another human being as human.